Now, wouldn't it be nice to see the buttons flash when we click it or press the key that corresponds to it? That way, the user will know that they pressed the right key and they're getting the right sounds. Now, given that we want this animation to happen both when the button gets pressed as well as when a keyboard key gets pressed, then we probably would want to create a function, right? So let's create this new function called button animation. And we're going to need a parameter to be passed in, which is the current key. And we can call this function in both places where we call make sound. So in this case, we've added an event listener to all 8 drum buttons. And then when one of them gets clicked, then it carries out this function. And inside this function, not only do we want to make sound using the current key, but we also want to generate the button animation. So let's call our method up here, and it's of course called button animation, and we're going to pass in the key of the button that was triggered. So that's going to be the same as our button inner HTML. So it's going to be exactly the same as before. So we're just going to add button inner HTML. Now in the case of our keyboard key press, we're also going to call that method button animation. And in this case, we're going to pass in the event key. So now in both cases, we're passing in exactly the same parameter. And that is going to be a single character corresponding to the key or the button that was pressed. So now that we have that value inside here, we can use it to generate the animation. So remember that in our index.html, we have 7 buttons which all have these classes assigned to them. And all 7 of them have the class drum. But they each have a different class depending on what's the letter inside the button. So we can use this in order to query our document for that selector. So we can say query selector, say .w. So that's going to be the element that has a class of W. Then we get back our W drum, this one here. And we can do the same thing with any of the other ones. Say K, then we get the K drum over here. Now notice that when we use query selector, we have to say dot and then the name of the class. It's just the same as in our CSS. So over here, if we want to query our document that has the class of the current key, then we have to write document.querySelector and we can add the current key. But the current key is just a single character and we need to concatenate a full stop in addition to the current key so that we get the same format as we've got here, .w or .k. So now that we've found the button that has the current key, let's assign this to a variable called active button. Now, this is the button that we're going to change its style. And the style that we want to apply has already been defined in our style.css. So in here, I've already created a class called pressed. And pressed basically applies a shadow and also a transparency to whatever element that we add this class to. So I want you to try and think back to the lessons where we spoke about of how we can add a class to an element using JavaScript. And you might have to think back a few lessons, but try and see if you can complete this challenge by adding the pressed class to the active button. So as always, it's good to test out your code inside the console. So let's just select the H1 by saying document.querySelector, H1, and we're going to tap into its class list. And remember, this is the list of classes that it has applied to it, which currently is nil. Now, once we've gotten the class list, we can add new classes. For example, this pressed class. And if I hit enter now, you can see that shadow and that transparency gets applied to our H1. Now, this is exactly what we want to happen, but to the button that got pressed. So we know the element that we want to apply it to. It's the active button. And all we have to do is just to tap into its class list and add the class of pressed. So now let's refresh our page. And you can see that when I click on any of the buttons, that transparency and the shadow gets applied to the button. Now there's just one problem. This doesn't come back. We kind of want it to have this depressed mode and then come back to the original so it looks like it's an animation. But in this case, I can't generate that effect ever again if I've clicked on one button. So how can we do that? Well, in order to do this, we need this line of code to be run. And then after a delay of, say, I don't know, 0.1 second, we want this class to be removed again so we get back to the original look. So how can we do this using JavaScript? Well, let's see what we can find online. So we're looking for a timeout function in JavaScript. And the first result we get back is from W3 Schools. And it's a method called setTimeout. And you can see that in their demo code, that when you run this line of code, that it'll wait 3 seconds and then it'll generate an alert that says hello. So this is exactly what we want. So let's look at how this method is structured. You can see that this is the syntax and the first parameter is the function. So this is the function that will be executed after a certain amount of time. And the second parameter is how much time to wait before running this function. So let's try it out in our code. So we're going to write setTimeout, and the first parameter is going to be the function that we want to be executed. So we're going to use an anonymous function, just as we have done before, and we're going to specify what we want to happen. So in this case, we want our active buttons class list to remove that pressed class so that it goes back to the original state. And the second parameter is the amount of time that we're going to wait before we run this function. So I think through some testing, it seems like 0.1 second seems to work best. So now we've got our active button that is found based on the current key that got pressed, and then we add the pressed class to give it that style of the shadow and the transparency. And then finally, after a wait of about 0.1 seconds, then we remove that class from the class list. So let's see what this looks like in action. Pretty neat, right? And if all goes well, it should also work for our key press event, because when the key press is detected, then this function gets called and we can tap into the event that triggered the key press by using event.key, which then gets passed into our method called button animation, and it will do exactly the same thing as it did for the button. That looks pretty cool, right? So I hope you had fun in this module building your very own DrumKit website, and in the process learning more about the document object model and some of the more advanced parts of JavaScript. Now in the next module we're going to jump even deeper and we're going to learn about a popular JavaScript framework called jQuery. So for all of that and more fun projects, I'll see you on the next module.